Welcome to Fashion. Really? A podcast for people who love fashion but hate what it does to life on our planet, and who like a bit of goss on what's been going on in fashion and culture lately, and how it's impacting people, animals, and the planet. Love from your favorite charity, Collective Fashion Justice. I'm Joshua, and this is Emma. Emma, how are you?
I'm very well. How are you? You're calling from somewhere with a very scary election happening right now. When this is public and live, one thing will have happened or the other, and I'm wishing you well.
Thank you. Yes, there's a contentious presidential election unfolding as we record. And when you listen to this, you will hopefully know what the result is. And we are hoping that that result is not disastrous. This is actually nice because I can ignore the live news feed of the unfolding drama.
Forget about the orange man for a little while.
Yeah, what's the perception on the other side of the globe about the American elections?
That it's grim. Grim in so many ways, but that the orange man, as I will continue to refer to him as, is obviously the worst possible way for so many reasons, including so many total ethics fashion related reasons, climate reasons, human rights issues in fashion supply chains, animal protection. We'll just see, won't we? Yeah.
When it comes to concerns for climate or acknowledgement that the earth has limits, the orange man's party is not the one that tends to be receptive or proactive. There's a tendency to refer to any environmental issue with a response of, well, we like clean air and clean water. That's what they think sustainability and the climate crisis are.
Very soft words for someone who is actively eroding democracy and everything under it. But let's not think about that for an hour. Let's think about other problems and also some less problematic things, because fashion is sometimes fun. Starting with Joshua, what are you wearing?
What am I wearing? I thought you would never ask. I am wearing clothing, as many of us do. That is why we all are participating in the fashion system, whether we are wearing secondhand clothing or vintage clothing or new clothing or hand-me-downs. We're all participating. I'm wearing a denim jacket and underneath another layer that is a painter's jacket. And then those are both from thrift stores. I'm wearing a t-shirt underneath my sweatshirt. The t-shirt is also thrift. My sneakers are also thrift. My socks are dead stock from probably the 1980s. And my pants are organic cotton from a brand that I'm sad is gone, Entire World. Do you remember Entire World?
No.
They were a great brand that did good sustainable basics. They had great pants, tops, underwear, things like that. And sadly, like many small sustainable brands, they're no longer with us. I'm wearing a Young Maven sweatshirt that's a hemp organic cotton blend.
Nice.
And I'm wearing a little necklace that says chutzpah, which is Yiddish for audacity, bravery.
Perfect for you and your audacity.
Yeah. What are you wearing? Tell me.
Well, first I was going to make a joke about thrift, laugh, love, because all of your things were thrifted. That's not very good, but I wanted to make it anyway. I am wearing a little black velvet bolero, like the little vesty things that I got vintage in Copenhagen, and it's got a cute little kind of floral fabric edging and kind of golden ribbon edging, and it's very cropped. And then underneath it, I'm wearing a dress that is totally sheer, and no bra, listenership, and then a tight velvet black skirt, and then red cowboy boots that are from Depop and vegan, but from a designer who made them while at London College of Fashion and was like selling her student wardrobe on runway, basically. So
now, if you weren't recording a podcast right now, what's the ideal place you would imagine wearing this outfit in your fantasy?
Somewhere where I don't move my arms widely, because I've limited myself to do that without having a very intentional nip slip. So there's that. But I also got new rings made by a local jeweler, and they're like very heavy silver. And they're my initials. So like if I punched someone really hard, my initials would be in them. But I wouldn't do that because I'm non-violent. And so is
But it would be backwards,
justice.
Right? The indent, the impression would be backwards. So
and because E is the kind of letter it is, it would be like, that would be what's left on them. I punched you.
You have to make that noise when you punch the person.
Exactly.
I mean, we have to just visualize that that's the orange man you're talking about, and and that you give out a great as those knuckles,
And then she saves the world. The end.
Yeah, the end.
Perfect.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
News.
Yeah, let's talk about the news, because the news is something that just keeps happening. It doesn't stop.
It just keeps on coming.
And no matter how bad you want it to stop, it just keeps coming. So what are the news items that you've got?
So to start light, and also to start following on from last podcast episode, which if you haven't listened to that, please go back. We were talking about Chapel Roan saying no to brand deals with shitty fast fashion brands, basically. And this month, people have been talking about the fact that her merch is too expensive. It's like $40 for a t-shirt. It's made in America with fair labor. It's recycled cotton. And I think that that's a really interesting conversation that's happening, because it's actually just the cost that it is to, make a t-shirt like that that's done responsibly. And people don't realize that, because fast fashion has really contorted the idea of what things should cost.
Yeah. Something costing more when it's been made with materials that cost more, when it's been made with labor that people are being paid fairly, those things all add up in the value chain. And I think that, do you think that there's like a lack of education or understanding among citizens and shoppers when they buy something and they, pick it out off of an online store, they pull it off of a rack, and they're, how do we carry the message of how that thing was made to justify the price? And why do you think there's this sort of suspicion that people are being duped?
Well, I think if everyone made their own clothes at least once, they would be more willing to buy clothes that cost more, because they'd go, this took me a really long time. It was quite hard. The materials cost money. And so if I'm buying something, I should expect that those same costs are the same, because we all deserve the same, just form of work. And also then we would buy less clothes, which brings me to my next piece of news, my main news, which is about California Responsible Textile Recovery Act / just about recycling stuff. So, speaking of overconsumption and overproduction, a truck full of textiles is sent to landfill every second of every day, of every month, of every year. Obviously, we cannot persist. Most of that is not recycled. That's why it's going to landfill, because most of the over 100 million garments that we're producing are not being recycled. Like 12 to 15% are, depending on where you get your data from. And now this new California law is trying to change that. And so companies that sell more than $1 million worth of product in the state will be mandated to help set up the state's textile recycling efforts so that materials can be sorted, because different materials can't be recycled in the same way, if it's a synthetic, if it's cotton, whatever. And it will also incentivize manufacturers of fabrics to begin with to make them in a way that is more easily recycled. It will take a while before everyone has to comply, like 2030. But that's because at the moment there's no real infrastructure anywhere to deal with the amount of clothes we're producing. So they have a lot to do before 2030. And frankly, part of that is they'll have to work out that part of it is they'll have to produce less. So many brands won't be able to make the amount of clothes that they make and be able to recycle it all.
Yeah. That's exciting. That's a landmark piece of legislation that's going. California is such a massive economy. Just the state of California's economy is bigger than some countries' economy. And And if any brand is making something in California, they're not going to just have a separate production system for California. It's going to end up affecting their national sales and maybe even their global sales. And it's going to set up really great systems for that sorting and creating, hopefully, waste stream feedstocks for next gen manufacturers who use textile waste for creating, their innovations.
And it's the same with the New York Fashion Act that is not an act yet; it's still a bill. But legislation that happens in these big states not only impacts brands that are global, but also can act as like a blueprint for legislation in other parts of the world. So that's a reason to have hope.
Yeah.
What's your news?
And speaking, before we move on to my news, speaking of, that piece of legislation and the California legislation, is there a good resource for people to wrap their heads around all the different pieces of legislation that affect fashion?
So heyfashion.org, they have a legislation tracker, which is really cool, so that you can see where stuff like this is in the process of being legislated, things that are being proposed, or that kind of thing. And there's so much happening. There's a lot more that's proposed than that actually ever becomes law, because there are people fighting against those laws as well, unfortunately.
That's a really good resource. I've used it where you can sort it by what's passed, what's pending, by region, and it's a really good one-stop place to kind of save in your bookmarks on your browser and check up on periodically to see what's being proposed, what's passed, what's moving, and wrap your head around the very confusing political landscape that affects fashion manufacturing.
Your turn. News. Hit me.
So a very quick piece of news on my side is just picking up something we spoke about last month, was some issues with the Made in Italy name. And recently they found that Pakistani migrant leather workers in Prato were assaulted after striking for better working conditions. And this is just adding to, an already troubled Made in Italy perception in the marketplace. And, in the documentary that you and I were in Slay, there is that connection between the cruelty that happens to workers and the cruelty that happens to animals. And when you look at the leather industry through that lens and you see the intersection of those cruelties, it's really something that needs to be addressed and see those connections be made.
It makes me think of, there was this report that we referenced in our report, very meta, about leather's impact on people. But there was one that I think was by the European Commission and a bunch of other groups called A Tough Story of Leather. And a lot of it looked at the Italian industry that is perceived, like we've said, as so luxurious. And they had quotes from lots of different workers in it, mostly migrant workers as well. And one of them said, "They squeeze you out like a lemon." And that quote just really stuck with me, because it's such a grim perception of how a human being is treated by this international profit-driven industry that's also built on animal exploitation, because we're talking about workers made to work with skins.
Yeah, there's many layers of bodies not being respected. And it starts at the very far end of the supply chain and is carried through to the actual folks working in those tanneries and in those leather factories. Tell me more.
Yes. About more news.
So my next news item is that You've heard of the term biodiversity, right?
No, never. Explain.
So biodiversity basically is the variety of all life on Earth. And without it, ecosystems would weaken, they would collapse. There is a disruption to natural stability and resilience that happens when biodiversity is compromised. And Kering, the luxury fashion conglomerate that owns Gucci and Saint Laurent and Bottega Veneta and Balenciaga, Alexander McQueen and others, they are the first and only fashion company to adopt science-based targets for nature. So this is pretty momentous. It's pretty meaningful. Science-based targets for nature are not to be confused with SBTIs, which are the Science-Based Targets Initiative.
Which is climate.
Right. That focuses on greenhouse gas emissions. These targets focus on biodiversity, and they go beyond just reducing emissions, and they're intended to address biodiversity, land use, water use, pollution, deforestation. And these scope 3 impacts will need to be confronted, like the significant ecological footprint of cattle rearing for leather or farmed animal rearing for wool, alpaca, cashmere, etc. So this part of the supply chain that often contributes to deforestation, soil degradation, greenhouse gas emissions, especially from something like methane, Caring is going to be assessing those most significant impacts on nature across its supply chain. And that's really exciting to see a company want to measure those.
Biodiversity, I remember, I think McKinsey did a report several years ago now saying that biodiversity would be the next frontier of fashion. And I really feel like we're starting to see that now. Very much needed. I also think something interesting on Caring to flag is they have their environmental profit and loss calculations that they made public. People can look at, and you can see by material the environmental cost that they have calculated for all of their different materials. And I've looked at it, and for leather, for wool, for these animal drive materials you're talking about, the both climate and the land impacts are so significant and calculated to be worth a massive loss. So I'll be really interested to see how they continue to deal with that. Also in a way of acknowledging that you can make these slight reductions and supposed like improvements of these supply chains, but they cannot be fundamentally changed. The land inefficiency, the climate inefficiency can't be fundamentally changed. And so that's when the Material Innovation Lab, which I know they also have, becomes very, very important.
It does. It does. And we're going to get into more of that later, material innovation and next-gen materials. But before we do, there's still a couple more quick news items. One of them is that Romania just banned fur this month.
Love that.
So that's really exciting. And it's the same month that a British MP introduced a bill to ban the import of fur for sale in the UK. And if you're somebody that's followed fur legislation, you might wonder, why is a ban on fur necessary when fur farming has been banned in so many countries?
Including in the UK, which I think is an important note.
Yeah, exactly. In the UK. So it raises an interesting question where if fur sales are still happening in a country where fur farming has been banned, doesn't that seem a bit counterintuitive? If fur is so cruel to produce, why would you be selling a product of that cruelty? So it shows how important it is to not only have a ban on fur farming, but also a ban on fur sales.
And to have consistent legislation. You know, if there's a certain value behind one policy, it should be continued out to other policies until that problem is genuinely removed rather than just somewhat fixed.
Yeah. And because the legislative landscape, again, is confusing and kind of all over the place, there's a really great resource. The Fur Free Alliance has a map globally that shows all of the different fur bans and fur farming bans, fur sales bans, any sort of limitation on fur production, manufacturing, and sales will be on that map. It's furfreealliance.com.
And hopefully all of Europe will end up on that website at some point.
Yes.
The Fur Free Europe campaign led by Eurogroup for Animals and that we are proudly part of. I spoke very briefly at the European Commission with the director of SLAY because the whole part of it is about fur. And I think it was like 1.6 million European citizens signed onto this European Citizens Initiative saying, yes, we want fur farming banned and we also want the sale of products from those farms to be banned. And the wheels of democracy take a long time to turn. But that would be nice.
It's always interesting to hear the quantity of people that are opposed, when they're given the choice, are opposed to animal cruelty and would choose something else. And at the same time, how disconnected shoppers and citizens are from the products that they're buying, and really understanding how those things resulted in those cruelties. And you see people buying things that they might not even realize came from the body of an animal, or the labor of somebody who was exploited, or from a material that's doing harm to biodiversity or causing a great number of emissions. And when people are really given the choice, of course, they want to make the more ethical and the kinder choice, but they're just not empowered to understand. Fashion is just such a secretive industry. It's an industry that hides behind fantasy. We've talked about that a lot. There's a reason why we need these fur bans, because there's still about 100 million wild animals that are farmed and killed every year globally for the fur trade.
The problem is not gone.
Yeah. And often, that number includes animals like rabbits, but there are some estimates that don't include animals like rabbits. They don't even count in the estimation. And the good news is that since 2014, the number of animals being killed has gone down, but 100 million is still pretty massive.
If you consider, an individual cage with an individual animal, so many. And I think that, when we see exploitation in one form, that kind of exploitation being justified really makes way for more exploitation, which is what I want to talk about for my last piece of news, which is about Abercrombie and Fitch. Are you ready for me to talk about this, Joshua? Or did you want to say anything else?
Please. I've heard of Abercrombie and Fitch. They fill my teenage shopping mall memories of feeling like I'll never aspire to such standards, and looking at their advertisements.
So do you remember topless male models being in the shopping mall?
Oh, like actual salespeople and people in the store not wearing shirts?
Apparently that was a thing. And
what?
There was a Netflix documentary like 2 years ago that I watched called White Hot, The Rise and Fall of Abercrombie and Fitch. And it talked about how like these really quite sexualized images of models, both women and men, were a big part of their advertising. That talked about racism, fat phobia, objectification of the people who were working for them. But this month, more news came and flagged that this news comes with a content warning about sexual abuse. But in late October, the longtime former CEO of Abercrombie & Fitch, Michael Jeffries, he was actually charged with running an international sex trafficking scheme as part of his work at the company. And this is because it was kind of like luring models into places where they were promised work, and actually that's not what happened. And the kind of sexualized nature of the brand overall probably helped make space for that. I care about this because I was sexually abused when I was working as a model as well by a photographer. And models are still a non-unionized workforce. So there's very little protection for them. And I think what's interesting about this and why I raised it in relation to fur is because I really believe that if a wealthy CEO is able to overlook modern slavery and human rights violations in their supply chain, it's probably not surprising that they not only are more able to exploit other people more directly related to them, but that the two things kind of build on each other. Do you know what I mean? Like if animal exploitation is rife in fashion, if environmental and human exploitation is, then it builds this environment where people are saying, yeah, we'll keep on giving you money, we'll keep on doing this, knowing you're doing this. And so people who have an even higher threshold of what they're willing to do to other people see that. It makes space for them to do that. And on that topic, I think it's worth acknowledging that organizations like CARE have said that 1 in 3 Cambodian women working as garment workers, for example, have faced sexual harassment. Like it's rife in the fashion industry. And it's something that we really don't talk about, but this headline has forced us to consider.
That's incredibly upsetting and disturbing, and thank you for sharing your personal story. And it having gone through something like that, I think empowers you to be a more empathetic advocate for all individuals in the supply chain who are impacted by the fashion industry. And I agree with what you said regarding those overarching standards and a worldview and an ideology within the fashion space, where if there are no ethical standards being enforced, if there are no moral standards being enforced, then what's to stop anyone from feeling that they have the power to just do whatever they want to whomever they want?
Totally. And it's why legislation is important, but we also need this cultural shift where we decide that we're all like worth something and have value across species, across gender and race, across everything. Yeah. And I think that, you know, we're not in the fun part of the podcast right now, but it's important. And I think also something that people outside of fashion, particularly women, can relate to, unfortunately. And I do think, like you said, even though no one should have to go through something like that to build empathy, like that should never happen. In my experience, at least, it does help you relate to others more and want suffering of others to be diminished. So thinking about that in a fashion context, I think, is valuable.
Yeah. Should we shift gears and talk about something that we've read?
Yes. Tell me what you've read.
I am actually reading some fiction right now.
Fun.
Which is unusual for me because I haven't read a fiction book in a really long time. I was seeking some escapism. I read some reviews of this book and it sounded cool. It's called Moonbound by Robin Sloan. I've got the book here.
Fun.
You can't see it because
you're listening
the way
to
that
a
our
podcast.
cameras are framed. But here, I'll hold it up for you where you can see it.
Very like Technicolor.
Yeah. So it is a science fiction book about 11,000 years in the future, and it's told from the perspective of a fungal-brained chronicler artificial intelligence that's embedded inside the protagonist.
Wow.
And I was so surprised to find, I didn't seek this out intentionally, I was surprised to find that in the book there's a lot of references to mycelium leather.
Oh.
There is references to animal wisdom, to these carbon accounting and architect beavers, to systems of wetware computation that are reliant on the biodiversity of bogs. There's biotech wizards. There's these fearsome artificial intelligence dragons. It is really kind of, an ecological sci-fi future world that's pretty fun to read about. So that's what I'm reading right now. What are you reading?
That is so interesting. Before I tell you about what I'm reading, it sounds really cool. It also reminds me of that show that we watched together in New York, but that was a bit more depressing than what your book sounds like. What was that called? Yes.
It was called Scavenger's Reign. It's a beautiful cartoon about life on, human life on an alien planet, and similar themes around nature and the environment and resources and artificial intelligence. I mean, we're in an age of artificial intelligence that is daunting and for many reasons, not just for the reasons that are, what are these future entities going to be capable of, but what are the impacts of AI having on the planet. We know it takes tons of resources and energy to run that, and so lots of stuff to think about. And so I recommend reading Moonbound by Robin Sloan and watching Scavenger's Reign.
So interesting. I did not read fiction this month. I did not have that form of escapism. I did have rom-com escapism. But my reading was, the one I'm sharing this time is Baptist World Aid and their Ethical Fashion Report. It's an Australian report, but it's highlighting 120 companies that own like 460 brands, and a lot of them are international. So it's relevant wherever you're listening from. Brands like ASOS, Birkenstocks, Levi, Doc Marten, Adidas, R.M. Williams, lots of them. They were looking mostly at labour rights issues. And guess what percent of the brands are paying a living wage only in the final stage? So the people sewing the actual garments, ignoring the people that are making the materials, farming the materials, all of that.
if I had to guess, I'm suspecting that
It's
because
bad.
you're posing the question, it's going to be really bad. But if I didn't have that preconceived notion, I would probably guess like, I don't know, like 30%.
1.6. So that's 2 companies.
0.6%.
Yes.
2 out of 120?
Yes.
That's bad.
It is bad. And
Ugh.
2 years ago, like vaguely there's been some improvement. 9.8% of the brands had shown that they were paying living wages to some of those facilities, but not all of them. And 36% have a commitment saying they'll do so at some point. Better than a kick in the head. 2 years ago, those numbers were 0.8% and 9.2% as compared to 1.6 and 9.8. So yes, there's been
there's been some
improvement.
microscopic improvement. Yeah.
You have to have, a little microscope to see it. And they calculated that at this rate of improvement, it will take 69 years for most brands to get a full score on their report that assesses the human rights and some environmental impacts of
69 years. Does that overshoot some of our 2030 targets?
I would say it overshoots
some of our 2050 targets even?
Yeah, and so I thought that this report was a good example of we need people to feel a bit of a fire under their ass, to be blunt. Like, we don't have time to have this level of microscopic change. And if we put ourselves in the shoes of people that are living that reality or that are going to face the brunt of the climate crisis sooner, we really don't have time. And so we need legislation, but we also need brands to just commit their own policy that is more legitimate more quickly.
Yeah. That is too slow and not enough. And I think what's happening is that some brands, when they realize that these targets are just in some ways difficult to obtain, they just abandon them. They say, oh, well, too bad. We don't want to do that anymore. And that's not an option. I mean, this isn't just a fun exercise. There's some good reasons why these targets need to be achieved. And yeah, that's disappointing. But what do you think, in addition to legislation, what do you think is going to help push that needle a little bit further than microscopic changes?
Well, I think, legislation doesn't exist in a vacuum. We need cultural change as well. And that cultural change and people power can in turn produce legislation, but also industry level policy, because I really do think that as greenwashing and ethics washing become something that people are more aware of, that brands are allowed to do less of, the ones that are not doing what they should be won't be able to market themselves as successfully as those that are. And, people will see...
So honest advertising.
Yeah. Call us crazy.
What's that? Honest advertising. It reminds me of in the middle of the 20th century when advertisements would just be here's these pair of shoes and they're comfortable and they look like this and you should buy them. Very straightforward, but also didn't unveil the manufacturing process. Yeah.
So I know, imagine if every time you walked into a store, you had to watch a video of where it was made, every stage of the supply chain before you could proceed. How rapidly that would change purchasing habits. A girl can dream. Should we talk about next generation material solutions?
Yeah, so now we're at the main topic.
We're deep diving
of our podcast. We're going to deep dive. I'm not the best diver.
I did diving for a little bit.
You did?
I look a bit gangly diving. I'm too tall. This kind is better.
What was your dive? What was your move? Is that what they're called in diving? Moves?
I honestly couldn't tell you anymore. I have no idea. But I realized I got better that I had to go off higher and higher things, and I didn't want to. I don't love scary. Heights.
Well, that tangent made absolutely no sense in relationship to what we're talking about. So I'll take the blame for that. But when it comes to the things that are going to help move the needle, some of those things are innovation, right?
Yes.
Some of those things have to do with the excitement around what's new, what's next, what's exciting, what is amazing and breathtaking. And a lot of innovation fits that profile. And that can help motivate. We can't just, we talked about a lot of dark stuff on this episode today. And that goes far, but it has to be matched with solutions. It has to be matched with inspiration and aspiration. And do you want to get started talking about next gen materials?
Yes. So for us, we define a next generation material as one that is free from animal-derived, fossil fuel-based and deforestation-driven sources, because we have to move beyond the interconnected harms that come from those things, not just from an ethical perspective, but because we literally have to if we would like a future in which we can all live on this lovely planet. Also that is circular, because we have to shift beyond a linear economy where we take, make and waste constantly. And so
before you move on, for listeners who might not understand the difference between like linear and circular economy, do you want to quickly break it down? Like linear, you just said you take, you make and you waste.
Yes.
So it's like the feedstock comes from, wherever. Let's say it's a cotton t-shirt, the cotton's grown, it gets made into a shirt, and then at the end of its life, it's thrown in the dump. That's linear, right?
Whereas a circular system, you might take something still from the environment, but in a much more responsible way. You might have like organic fair trade cotton, but you would have less of that because you would also have materials that start from an existing product. So you might have some that's from cotton, and then someone wears it, and then when they're not wearing it anymore, that cotton shirt could be being recycled and it could be being made into a new shirt, a new garment. It could be being made into like a cellulosic material because of the cellulose in cotton. It could be being made into the basis of a plant-based leather because some of them have some cotton inputs. And so instead of that line going from taking and then just in the bin, everything remains in this loop of the economy. And anything that does have to go out goes out in a way that still remains kind of regenerative, because it might be going to waste, but that waste can biodegrade, it can compost, and so it can still positively benefit like the circle of life, basically.
And in an ideal scenario, a circular economy would be perpetual, and it wouldn't be unrealistic. Like there's things that you can only reuse so many times before it has to find a different end use, or it has to be composted, or it has to, enter some other. But there are really amazing innovations in chemical recycling, in textile to textile recycling, where they're really figuring out how to theoretically, reuse things for an infinite number of times. And I think those technologies are going to only get better and better. So that was the tangent on circularity and linear. But you defined next gen as being free from animal, fossil, deforestation sources, circular. What else?
They also need to align with total ethics fashion, which we've talked about. So it's not just the environmental aspect, but also the human rights, the animal rights component. And there's a lot of promising materials that come with that, that have really good opportunities for economic uplift, that are all kinds of things. Joshua, what are some of the most exciting materials, next-gen materials on the market at the moment, and why are they so exciting?
There are a lot, and that's good. There's a lot of innovation happening. There's a lot of great IP out there, and IP just meaning intellectual property. And some of these things are being invested in. Some of them are scaling. They're at all different stages and phases of their journey as a business. And some of the materials that I'm going to mention today are the ones that are in the process of either leaving pilot scale and ending up on their way to being scaled. So firstly, I want to talk about a material that I've used personally in my collections. The material is called Mirum. It's made by Natural Fiber Welding. It's commercially available. I've used it on all sorts of shoe styles, And it's a plastic-free, animal-free leather replacement that looks and feels like leather, and it's made from agricultural waste. It is there's so often you hear the argument that vegan leather is just plastic, so it's worse for the environment. And not only isn't that true, but materials like this show that you don't even need to have plastics in the materials in order to replace leather. Another great material is BioVera by Modern Meadow. And this is something that's available at commercial scale, which is exciting. It is the strongest, lightest, most suede-like vegan leather that I've ever handled. And I've seen a lot of them and I've touched a lot of them. It has a non-woven scaffold. What that means is typically, leather replacements will be a piece of canvas that has like a material placed on top of that canvas in order to mimic the look and feel of leather. And over time, canvas-backed materials, they tend to fray on the edges. They'll tend to crack. They'll tend to break. But a non-woven really mimics skin. It's more durable. It's longer lasting. It's stronger. And so while BioVera isn't 100% plastic free, it is derived from 100% upcycled materials, married with their proprietary product called a bioalloy, which is a flexible mix of plant-based proteins and polymers. And so while it's not the silver bullet, it is by far a superior product that is, I would still consider it next gen, and it is going to result in products that last a really long time, that are really strong, and don't harm animals, and that's a lot. BioFluff is a material that is 100% plant-based and biodegradable fur. They have a product called Savion. Is that how you would pronounce it?
It is.
Savion. There are some exciting cellulosic recycled materials that are replacing silk. For example, the company Cirque, they make a cellulose pulp from recycled waste textiles, and they have the technology to separate polycotton blends, which is really important and really exciting. Because if you think about the waste stream and how many garments can't be recycled because they're not 100% cotton or 100% poly, when there's a blend, it poses a problem. But they've developed a technology that can recycle those blends and separate those elements. And it makes their feedstock less difficult. It's less daunting. And recently, there's an Indian company called Aditya Birla Group, and they, along with Cirque, have figured out how to scale Cirque's technology so that they've agreed to buy 5,000 tons per year over 5 years.
Wow.
And what that does for an innovator is it gives them a bridge over what is so often called the valley of death for innovators, where their business will fail because they hit a point where they need to scale and the resources aren't there, and then they can't move forward, and the business goes under. So it's really exciting to see Cirque scaling. And lastly, I'll mention EcoPel, which is a faux fur company that makes two products called Koba and Gasha, and those are both bio-based faux furs. Are there any innovations or next-gen materials that you want to mention?
You've said so many things, and I want to say things in response. Firstly, I think that the thing you said about silver bullet is really important to note. Like when you were talking about a material not being perfect, if we don't invest in materials that are not yet perfect but far better than the current gen materials, they never get an opportunity to become better. Like innovators are replacing massive problems, and so if they can improve them a lot, they should be supported to continue to improve. On Miriam, because I'm a facts gal, I wanted to share something from a few different sources, but all referenced in our leather reports. Miriam has a climate impact 108 kilos smaller than cowskin leather when looking at carbon equivalent emissions, and 14 times smaller than a normal polyurethane synthetic. So for both of those materials that we have to move beyond, massive difference. Some other leathers, because leather absolutely is the one where there's the most alternative materials. There's the Sharinga bio leather that we're making a film about at the moment, which is working with Indigenous communities. There's banoffee, which is made from banana leaf waste that is otherwise burnt by farmers, so it helps to support those farmers. There's also Vitro Labs, which is literally like a lab-based cell leather. That's interesting, and I feel like we could go into that in more depth another time.
The cellular agriculture and precision fermentation and lab grown materials. That is an exciting topic that we have to cover in more depth in the future.
Polybion, like bacterial cellulose leather, also flower down for feather down. There's many. This could be a whole podcast, just us listing material after material. Because if we think that we can solve fossil fuel materials and animal materials and deforestation materials in like 5 years, it's such an unrealistic pressure to put on these scientists and innovators that are solving problems that took a long time to come into existence to begin with.
There are a lot of great brands that are also working with these innovations and taking them into the public sphere, making them exciting and aspirational, putting them on runways, putting them in collections as much as they possibly can. Burberry incorporated Spiber, which makes a spider protein silk that is biologically similar or identical to the silk that spiders would make without the use of actual spiders. And Patrick McDowell sent a mycelium bag using Ecovative's forager material down a runway. Pangaea worked with Mirum. There's just so many examples now where I think it's becoming. I used to sort of wonder why every season when we would see the shows and fashion brands would create their new collections, there was almost this illusion of momentum, of forward motion, of, what's next, what's new. And often it was only an illusion. It was just about how something looked or the cut or the shape or the texture. But now I think we're entering an era where each season we are actually seeing progress being made with material innovation and improvements that are being measured, targets being set. And that is the fashion industry that I think you and I want to be part of.
All of this next gen material stuff is so exciting, but I think it's also important for us to be realistic and talk about the problems that are still faced. I would say my first problem is there's not yet quite the diversity of what types of materials are being replaced. For example, given the fact that like 70% of materials now are synthetic, there's not enough when you think about like nylon and materials for bathers, for stretchy athleisure stuff that can't be replaced by other things so easily. There could be more there. For all of the amazing leather alternative materials, there is really not enough for wool at all. That Spiber protein fiber that you talked about can be made into fluffy, woolly kind of things like Burberry's scarf. It was a scarf that they made from Spiber. But wool is hard. The way that it's made is complicated, but it's so important that we address it. So I think that is a real problem. Funding is a problem. What else would you think is a problem?
I think that there's a lot to learn about scaling, and there's a lot of really great innovation out there. There's a lot of wonderful ideas, and those ideas might be able to be proven at what's considered lab scale or pilot scale. Those refer to stages in the innovation life cycle that are early, and it's small volumes. But when you talk about taking something that's being made at pilot scale and getting it to commercial scale, to industrial scale, the mountains that need to be moved, the stakeholders that need to be brought in to make that happen, it is no small task. And just because something's a good idea doesn't guarantee that it's going to succeed. And I think one of the best cases of really understanding how those forces played out is what happened to RenewCell. And, in addition to my work on the board of directors at Collective Fashion Justice, our listeners might know I also work at Canopy, and there's a really wonderful resource specifically about that bankruptcy that RenewCell went into and the lessons that have been learned because of that bankruptcy and how it was able to be saved and they emerged under their name Circulose. But I would highly recommend, we don't have time to go into all the details here, but if you go on the internet and just Google RenewCell, a springboard, not a hurdle, there's a really great report and paper that was released from Canopy that really goes into detail on what it takes to scale, what went wrong, what are the lessons that were learned, and how these next-gen innovations, if they're going to really make the global impacts that they need to make, we have to get to industrial scale for many of them to replace those more problematic materials.
That's really interesting. And also, when I was at the Global Fashion Summit this year, someone spoke about the fact that if you look at fashion compared to tech or food or these other big industries, the amount of profit that is put into research and development that can help with things like scaling innovation is so minuscule. So our industry has a lot to learn from these other industries and the way that they have helped innovation become something that is worldwide.
There's a lot to catch up on with fashion because for so long, fashion was seen as a mark of frivolity and surface and vanity. As we've talked about before, there's that misogyny and and anti-queerness that go into the perceptions of fashion as being something that's a feminine interest and therefore not serious. And so, it's more recently that we are finally able to take fashion very seriously, and we've got a lot of catching up to do, not only for ourselves but for the people that still write fashion off as something that's not as serious as food or not as serious as medicine.
So we're going to finish with a little greenwash. Love finishing with mocking someone who's done something wrong. No,
let's mock them. They, if anybody deserves to be mocked, it's the greenwashers.
So the greenwash of the month is actually a more collective greenwash. And it's in relation to this documentary that's out now that is called Buy Now, The Shopping Conspiracy. It's on Netflix and it is basically exposing the greenwash of companies that don't want you to know how much money they spend on making sure that you buy more stuff and how they influence your psychology to make sure that you buy more stuff when it doesn't benefit you, your wallet, the planet, anyone. And I am referring to this as greenwashing because there's so much talk of companies not being able to afford to help innovators scale up, of not being able to afford living wages for their whole supply chain, of all that kind of thing. And I think that in itself is a greenwash of making these brands appear as though they would love to do more if they could, but so much of their investment goes into what I think is going beyond sales. Obviously, fashion brands have to sell their product, but when it gets to this level of sales that is so manipulative and it goes to the point where you lose the quality of the product because you're spending less time on making something really beautiful that people want and more time on just make sure they get it, regardless of if we've made it something that people would just go, gosh, isn't that the most beautiful dress? And that is why they want it, instead of because of emails that are constantly plaguing them and social media ads and all of that kind of thing. So I've only seen the trailer. It has the ex-head of Adidas, lots of big people talking about what goes on behind these closed doors and saying people believe and want to believe they work for brands that are not evil, is the word is used in the trailer. But sometimes these people are saying they don't feel that's the case. So I'm very excited to watch that.
So our homework assignment
and
your homework assignment is to go watch that documentary.
Yes.
And hopefully we'll revisit it next time, and we'll have to let each other know what we think.
Yes. And what else are we putting on homework? I'm making a homework list now. You should read Total Ethics Fashion. You should look at our Just Transition Beyond Leather report. It has a full list of all of the different innovators for that particular space. What else should people do for homework, Joshua? Rate our podcast.
Just go to Collective
so highly.
Fashion. Yeah, go to collectivefashionjustice.org. If you haven't been to the website, I mean, it's a gold mine of resources, and just the reports alone, I think, are just beautiful to look at. I think they're designed so beautifully, and then they contain information that is empowering. It's great to know what you're talking about and to be able to back it up with research and data and facts. You can feel passionately about things, but I want to tell you that there's nothing more satisfying than being able to be like, I care deeply about this, and
I have receipts.
Also, here's the receipts, here's the facts, here's the numbers, here's why what I'm saying is correct. That and you can get that information on collectivefashionjustice.org. So go. And who's the author of that book that you mentioned?
That book that I shamelessly plugged, it might be me. All the funds do fund our charity and not me directly. But I love the charity, so it does. Anyway, thanks for listening, everyone. Next time, we're going to have more stuff to talk about. That's always the plan. And instead of next-gen materials for this time, next time we're talking about overproduction and consumption. So the greenwash was pretty relevant to that. We'll also talk about everything else, because we always do our best. So thanks for listening.
Thanks, Emma. It's nice to see you.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. Bye.